thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join this colloquium. So very briefly, I'm going to be speaking to a specific sort of sub-question when it comes to basic income, and that is specific to the world of work. We've heard quite a bit around poverty reduction, equity implications, but also, of course, the world of work is a key dimension to all of this. And we've heard a bit about this also from the previous speaker from Guillaume. Thanks for that. Just to say that I think that one of the, so I mean, there are several reasons why we're seeing this renewed interest in a universal basic income. And one of the reasons why we're seeing this is a growing perception or understanding that the economy and existing welfare policies and wider fiscal policies are not delivering for a large part of the population. And in the world of work, we're seeing persistent and in some cases growing inequalities linked to trends in wages, so wage stagnation, job insecurity, the rise of non-standard employment. But also some of these inequalities aren't necessarily linked to recent trends. And specifically, if we think of some of the gendered inequalities in the world of work that arise not just from sort of differences in the world of work, but also by how existing social welfare programs and fiscal policies interact with existing inequalities to reinforce gender inequalities in the world of work. This is a very obviously timely and growing topic, an issue that I think we're still examining as to what extent this renewed interest in a UBI, which of course is not a new idea, but it has in recent years and in recent months, also in the context of the COVID crisis, has picked up even more momentum. I mean, there's a question about to what extent it's informing policy reform and practice, and I think we're seeing some examples already of direct influencing of ideas and practice there. But beyond that, in any case, at a very minimum, what's I think very welcome is that the UBI debate is opening up a whole host of questions that in some circles at least were considered closed. I mean, some of the circles that I've been working in, had pretty much agreed on a number of things, including how we conceptualize work, what are the adequate or most appropriate social transfers in pursuing objectives, including in the world of work. And thankfully, the UBI debate and related practices actually are throwing open again some of these questions. And at a very minimum, what they're doing is they're encouraging or pushing people to think again and think twice about in many circles, in many policy and research circles, near exclusive focus on work in terms of paid work and relatedly on financial incentives. And what it's doing is it's bringing back, re-emphasizing the need and the relevance of wider questions around the type and conditions and quality of work. And when it comes to policy design, it's opening up questions around, again, these are not new, but certainly re-emphasizing around the adequacy of targeting practices, including around specific means testing practices that have certainly had gained popularity over recent decades, the role of conditionality, the treatment unit, whether you design policy around households or individuals, and so forth. I, in particular, I'm going to focus, as I say, on the work-related dimensions of some of the arguments and the evidence. And in particular, I will try and summarize some of the arguments and link the available evidence to these arguments around 4 sets of interrelated work considerations. One has to do with the participation in paid work. This is, commonly historically been a big concern for many people, including, critics of UBI that are concerned that a full basic income will lead to reductions in participation in paid work. A second concern is around conditions of paid work. Would a UBI Does it risk subsidizing low-paid, insecure work? It might have that effect. You know, some of the critics warn. Others argue it holds potential to be rather emancipatory by offering a minimum income floor. You're providing workers with options, an exit strategy, for instance, or for stronger collective and bargaining mechanisms that might be associated with improved conditions of paid work. There are questions around the valuation and distribution of unpaid work, where on the one hand, some have argued, and if I think, specifically, and I'll speak specifically to the question of domestic and care unpaid work, just to keep it to a specific example, where on the one hand, proponents of a UBI argue that it could offer women in particular, but carers more broadly, with an option and support participation in paid employment and redistribution of unpaid work, versus critics that worry that actually all a UBI really will do, because of its individual and universal design features, it will end up reinforcing gendered roles and the unequal distribution of unpaid work across genders. And finally, a quick question on formal and informal employment, which of course is linked to the question of conditions of paid work, but question marks around whether basic income, by additionally delinking social transfers and social protection from employment status, risks weakening the incentives essentially to formalize employment, and what that might do in contexts where we're already facing high informality and or moving towards increases in non-standard forms of employment and related informal situations of employment, with all the repercussions that has. So in particular, from a purely sort of practical / empirical perspective, the points of interest here are twofold. I mean, on the one hand, what do we know about how the defining features of a UBI matter to these sets of outcomes, and what have we learned from the experience to date? And I'll come back to what we mean by that, but what have we learned about how different parameters or variations in how a UBI is designed, or indeed as compared also to other types of social or cash transfers? How will that affect these outcomes and the way basic income performs in practice? And then relatedly, how does the wider context matter, and how does the wider positioning of a UBI or basic income scheme within wider fiscal and social policies matter to how it performs? And 2 points here. One, of course, is that we talk about a basic income, but as has already been said, basic income, even if we restrict ourselves to basic income schemes that have the key, that comply, so to say, with the key defining feature insofar as they're universal and conditional, individual periodic payments, even within that, they can vary, of course, importantly by value. The level of the transfer, we know, we've already heard, will matter. But so does also the wider context. Again, this has been amply said, but to discuss a basic income or UBI in isolation of the wider fiscal tax and transfer system, but even wider social policies and, of course, labor policy in the context when we're concerned about work outcomes is extremely misleading. So this wider picture needs to be, excuse me, taken into account. A quick word on the nature of the evidence. So, I mean, I was asked to speak specifically to the evidence, and thanks to Guillaume for already, in fact, dealing with a lot of the issues there very clearly and very comprehensively. And I think, fully, everything, pretty much everything he said resounded with my perspective of things. I think with maybe a couple of questions, but I think, it's true to say that there's been limited experience in terms of full basic incomes that as we say, that actually reflect all the dimensions or qualities of a full UBI. But there are a couple, and there is evidence that that is available with respect to these existing schemes, the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, the Iranian was effectively a universal transfer, at least for a period in the aftermath of a fuel or gas and bread subsidy reform. So there is evidence arising from these cases. We also have, quite a body of evidence arising from other types of schemes, some of which, by some dimensions, approximate a basic income type scheme. Many of these are negative income taxes, including the ones, the so-called basic income experiments, misleadingly labeled as such, but still it did have some elements that were implemented in the 60s and 80s in the US and Canada. And then, of course, a whole body, large and expanding body of evidence arising from different types of cash transfers implemented in countries worldwide, that it may include, of course, varying elements of targeting, including means testing and conditionalities, but that can vary very significantly along a spectrum. So such cash transfers can include, in some countries that I'm thinking of course, are not UBIs, but are very large minimum income guarantee schemes, all the way, of course, to schemes that are much more narrowly means tested to very, to very small population subgroups. Now, I think, a point is that what I have certainly found very interesting is that I think there's something to be learned, and that can be usefully used in a UBI or basic income discussion from the evidence that arises from cash transfers more broadly. So the fact that some of the evidence on, for instance, the work-related impacts of certain types of means testing or indeed conditionalities can very usefully be used to inform, moving forward, what would a basic income look like? So in some of what I'm going to be talking about now, some of the evidence is coming through from schemes that are indeed not basic income type schemes, and I will qualify that, but can still tell us, I think, something that we can usefully use for then talking about basic income moving forward. I also, going back to Guillermo's points around the nature of the evidence, it's absolutely true that by definition, a basic income, it's the evidence that we have that comes out of Alaska and elsewhere are primarily aggregate measures, sometimes macro level, or comparing, say, employment rates or number of hours worked or wages across states and not at the individual micro level, precisely because of the nature of the scheme. So for the very reasons he already very eloquently exposed, if we are looking to capture a causal effect on, particularly at the micro level, by definition that you can't do that with a basic income. One point, if I did understand correctly from the previous discussion we just had, was that there was a sense that this for some reason would be possible in non quote unquote developed countries, so in developed quote unquote, countries, this would be feasible, would not be feasible, an experiment of this kind, while in developing sort of low and middle income countries, an experiment of this kind would be feasible. I'm not sure if I got that correctly, but I would argue that that's not the case. And indeed, if we go and see what are currently, what are now labeled as basic income experiments, including in Kenya, I saw in the chat a reference to the Kenyan experiment. I would probably argue that's still not, it's a misnomer. It's not a basic income. Yes, there are villages, entire villages that are receiving a regular payment, and the plan is that villagers will receive a payment for 12 years. But of course, there are it's labeled as an experiment because there are an equal or very high number of villages that are not in receipt of the so-called basic income. So already it's not a basic income. And a second related question is where the funding is coming from. But again, if we cannot delink the spending side from the financing side, in my point of view, it's a key feature of a basic income. If the funding is coming, as in the Kenyan case, the Give Direct experiment from Seattle or where it's coming from, or other fund, private funders, then again, I think we just need to be careful about, is that really a basic income that is not linked to national or indeed more broadly, public finding mechanisms. But I'll leave that to that, and hopefully we can come back to some of these points. Moving on, and I apologize in advance, what I'm going to try and do is very brutally summarize the evidence around some key points, and that inevitably means that we'll lose some of the details, but will hopefully be somewhat useful to the conversation. So on participation in paid work, this is an age-old concern for many. Or the UBI is going to end up leading people to work even less than regular cash transfers that might have a means test or are targeted, because one of the reasons being that it's not conditional. So compared to, say, a transfer that includes work requirements, a UBI, and people will be working even less, there will be so-called incentives to be lazy. On the other hand, of course, again, if we look on paper, from a pure theoretical perspective, a UBI avoids the disincentive effect generated by a means test. This was, again, this has all been already, I think, amply discussed, particularly when the means test is narrow. When it leads to a high marginal tax rate or benefit withdrawal rate, you do create a disincentive to work. This in turn varies along the income distribution. There's a vast literature on this. So what would a basic income do? Just by way of background, just to say that many of these discussions, of course, the focus is naturally on paid employment, financial incentives, and a concern, a sense that any reduction in participation in paid work is a negative outcome. Of course, I think we were well agreed, many of us, that that's not necessarily a negative outcome. Actually, a reduction in paid work may be a very positive thing from a number of perspectives, but we'll come back to that in a second. But again, summarily, what does the evidence say? Whatever source we go to, if we look at the experience to date, including in basic income, full basic income schemes, or ones that are sort of approximate or that are very large and comparatively generous in terms of coverage and regularity of payment, there's no evidence of a clear reduction in participation in paid employment. Certainly if you look at the aggregate figures, estimates for Alaska, of course, more recently in Iran, elsewhere, there is this fear of a sort of mass reduction in participation in paid work. Whether you look at the extensive, so whether you're looking at actual participation in paid work or numbers of hours worked. Sorry, are you waving to me, Bruno? No.
Just to remind you that it's time to conclude.
Oh no, oh goodness me. Okay, just very quickly, no evidence. Of course, it varies by population subgroup. Once you start to break down, in some cases, yes, there is evidence of basic income type schemes. Certainly if we look, for instance, at the universal child grant in Germany and elsewhere being associated with reductions in participation in paid employment, for instance, in women with children. But again, equally, experience from South Africa, where they have a large child grant and or other types of cash schemes that are universalistic in nature by some dimensions at least, actually promoting participation in paid employment. And the reasons for this are varied. We can come back to the policy implications in a minute. Conditions of paid work, and apologies for running through this, but we've seen the argument, the argument is that, in principle, you could, help ensure people leave exploitative work, turn down low paid work, or vice versa. There's a concern that it may subsidize this type of work. Here too, actually, if you look at the evidence of various nature, including more aggregate macro type evidence, or at the micro level, at the individual worker level, there is the evidence suggests that this can happen. The basic income type scheme can indeed support transitions to better forms of employment and better work. This comes out of the Manitoba sort of guaranteed minimum income experiment. It comes across in cash transfers that are not conditional, that do not have conditionality requirements. I think this is quite key across countries worldwide, and happy to provide more information on that, where we see very clear transitions. The cash transfer is associated with, or indeed leads to, we have counterfactual analysis indicating a clear impact on transitions to quote unquote sort of better forms of work and employment, and away from exploitative type work. so on the distribution of unpaid work, we heard the case. Again, theoretically, it could go in various directions. In practice, there are examples, again, evaluations that show equally, either in some cases, indeed, women as a result of a basic income type scheme reducing participation in paid work, and that's suggesting that the income scheme cash transfer is reinforcing a certain, the unequal distribution of unpaid work. But again, also conversely, examples of that not happening, particularly where the basic income is allowing women to, for instance, pay for childcare, or pay for work that they otherwise would be carrying out. One of the key conclusions to this from a policy perspective, and we can hopefully come back to the policy implications of all of this, is that the collocation of the articulation of a UBI within wider social policies matters hugely, and they need to be accompanied by wider efforts, for instance, in this particular case, to redistribute the allocation of unpaid work across the sexes. Transitions on formal and informal work, there's evidence that an income transfer that automatically targets informal, formal workers, which is something that we've seen many contexts, and excludes formal workers, will have a disincentive effect to formalization. And similarly, a recent study on Brazil indicating how a cash transfer, a large-scale minimum income guarantee, can support formalization. And here, the evidence again indicates that what is critical for a basic income scheme or basic income type scheme to continue to support formalization is, again, the wider picture, so that a UBI should under no circumstance end up replacing other welfare provisions, or indeed including contributory schemes that help regulate the work relationship. So that's okay. That's all from me for now. Thank you.
I'm sorry, we have to stick to the timetable.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think that was a very complimentary contribution.